¿Qué hay? ¿Cómo están? Buen día a todos. Let's go Forbes. Hi, Dr. Forbes. Dr. Creatine, how are you doing? Only one supplement is king. I'm sure you're talking about BCAAs. Vamos a esperar un segundito en lo que se conecta Menno. Y si no, cualquier cosa, ahorita reinicio la transmisión. Creo que no lo puedo invitar. Is it sync? Probably. Ok, creo que ya anda por acá Menno. Denme un segundo. There you go.
Hello.
Hello, how are you doing, man? Great to see you again.
Good. You?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for taking the time. It's always a huge pleasure. I think this is the third time we've spoken, so thanks again, man.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Always a pleasure. Let's do it.
Let's do it, man. How you been? You're currently in Spain, right? Madrid?
Yep. Madrid.
Very well. The last time I spoke to you, I think you were in Portugal, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Currently, my Portuguese is kind of. I have a love-hate relationship with the fact that I knew Portuguese before I'm now studying Spanish. So it's, on the one hand, it helps, but on the other hand, I think of a lot of Portuguese words when I want to say something in Spanish.
That's awesome, man. Do you want to do this in Spanish, in Español? We can try if you want to.
It's going to be difficult.
Very well, man. So the topic at hand, supplements. There's some topics that I wanted to discuss about this big topic that is supplements. And if you agree, I'd like to start with how do supplements get started, and specifically about the placebo and the nocebo effect, which I think are quite fascinating. How can we know that some supplement is actually doing what it's claiming it's doing, and then some supplements don't do the opposite? And do you think it's a good place to start with placebo and nocebo?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, because I think the funny thing is, in nutritional sciences, if you study almost anything and you give it to people in a pill, then it will improve whatever you want it to improve. A little bit, not a lot, but at least a little bit. And that's called the placebo effect. It's when you subconsciously believe that something will happen, then your body actually changes in a way that makes it more likely that that does happen, to at least some degree. So if you are consuming a pill and you think you're going to get stronger from that pill, then you can actually, in the case of getting stronger, probably your motivation will be higher, and some processes in the body will be different. We don't fully understand how it works, because the placebo effect can be quite miraculous indeed. But some processes in the body are different that make that expectation more likely to come true. It seems there is kind of a two-way street in the body where expecting something to be true and like a change in the body, right? And actually getting that result seems to be going in both ways.
That's really interesting, because if I'm not mistaken, I think there's actually a, how do you call it? A dose-response relationship. If you give someone more placebo, they get more effect.
Yes, there are even supplements where the placebo has a dose response, but the supplement itself does not. We see this in research for caffeine, for example, where if you give people more caffeine, then there is often not a greater increase in the effectiveness of the caffeine. But if you tell people that they're getting more caffeine, then there is. So the placebo effect has a dose response, whereas the actual supplement does not, which is crazy, right? And there's also something called open label placebo, which is where someone has a placebo effect. And if you tell people it's a placebo effect, it doesn't change the effectiveness. Sometimes it goes down a little bit, but not that much. And that's also why I think with supplements, you should generally be open to, for example, my clients and students. I tell all my students also for their clients, like, just be open, tell your clients which supplements work, which of them don't work, because if they intuitively believe that a supplement works, they're still going to get the placebo effect. Because you could argue, if you tell your clients their supplement doesn't work, then they lose the placebo effect, but that's not the case. And the framing is very important too. I think if you tell them, like, you can get the same results without this, like you frame it positively rather than this doesn't work, then you can basically maintain the benefit while they save money.
Because, for instance, with creatine, that I'd like to discuss further on, I think a lot of people know that it's the king of supplements. We had Scott Forbes right here in the conversation. If you tell someone, oh, creatine is great, it does this, it does that, and then you take it, do you think that increases the effectiveness of creatine?
I think if you hype it up, it can increase the effectiveness. But if you tell people it doesn't work, like the most important thing is what they actually believe. Like, regardless of what you're saying about it or other people are saying about it. So, because it's mostly a subconscious effect. So if you tell people, yeah, this is amazing, but people are like, yeah, I've been hearing about creatine for 10 years and I don't feel any different when I'm using it, then it probably won't increase the effectiveness just by saying it does work. So it really depends on how much people believe you.
Very well. And can we discuss the opposite side of placebo, which is nocebo? What is nocebo effect, and is there any research on it?
Yeah, so placebo comes from Latin, and it means I shall please. And kind of the dark twin of the placebo effect is nocebo, which means I shall harm. And it means the opposite. So if you have negative expectations about something, you give people a pill and you say, well, this is going to have as a side effect that you're not going to be as strong. Then indeed in the gym you're probably not going to be as strong. So it's basically the same effect, but it's a negative expectation effect rather than a positive expectation effect.
Very well. And also in regards to the research itself on supplements, how difficult it is to isolate training, nutrition variables, individual variability from the effect of the supplement itself?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, with a control group that you give a placebo, typically that's how they do it in research. So then you know what the placebo effect is, and you see if something is better than placebo.
Very well. So moving on to discuss supplements in particular, I'd like to begin with supplements, let's say, for muscle gain. And obviously, it was to be expected. Can we discuss a little bit about creatine monohydrate? And one question I wanted to ask you directly, in your opinion, is it overrated, or do you think it lives up to the hype?
Well, I think creatine at this point might actually be underrated, because it's pretty much the only supplement that not even consistently works, but that for a decent proportion of people actually works. But it's been so, well, it's also gotten more expensive recently, but I don't think that's really the barrier for most people. I think it's kind of past its hype and popularity in supplement companies. They don't advertise it anymore because there's not that much money to be made with creatine. So you don't hear much about it anymore. And many people that tried it, they become kind of disillusioned with it. It's true that about a third of people are basically non-responders. So they already have enough creatine in their muscle stores. I think I'm one of them. I don't notice any difference. I don't gain the weight. When I don't experience the increase in work capacity. I don't experience an increase in muscle strength. I mean, the rate is hard to say, but I don't see any of the acute effects. So no water retention, anything. So I think I'm probably pretty close to a non-responder or a non-responder. And even people that are responders, they kind of see that the difference is so small that they stop using it. And I think that is actually kind of a disillusionment of the supplement industry as a whole, or at least it should be, because sometimes these people then do start taking BCAAs or other stuff that definitely does not work. So probably a wrong interpretation. But if you're not impressed with creatine, then yeah, there's pretty much nothing there that really will increase your gains in terms of direct muscle growth or strength development. I think there are some supplements that are conditionally useful for some individuals, but there's nothing like steroids or, like you could take it and your gains are going to be massively better.
Not even HMB. Now, I'd like to discuss HMB, but further on, if you agree, I wanted to ask you about creatine monohydrate, a couple of things. This water retention, we know that it's intracellular. In what degree does that help with muscle gain, with recovery, with all its proposed benefits? And how can we know as creatine users that we are responders or not so much?
Mm-hmm. So creatine operates via a few different mechanisms. The most straightforward is that you simply store more creatine in your muscles as creatine phosphate, and breaking down the high energy phosphate bond, so it's actually the phosphate bond, not the creatine itself, produces a lot of energy, which allows your body to rapidly produce energy during movement, and as a result, you are stronger and you can basically perform like a few more repetitions in particular. Like actual raw strength is not affected that much. It's mostly you can do a few more repetitions, typically 1 or 2 across sets. And that means you allows you to put more tension on the muscle and get greater strength development and greater muscle growth.
That leaves me thinking, I'm sure you've seen this meta-analysis about training to failure and hypertrophy. I think it was published a couple days ago. Let's say creatine allows us to perform a couple more reps. Does that actually would translate to more hypertrophy? If proximity to failure could be we could be less, farther away from failure. These things always confuses me a little bit. Do you think there's still a possible benefit in that particular regard?
Yes, I think there have been like 5 systematic reviews, most of them also meta-analyses on training to failure. And the last one, if I'm not mistaken, is the one on velocity-based training.
Right.
And it's found that for muscle hypertrophy, going closer to failure does increase your gains. And the increase seems to be mediated by the increase in total volume load. So basically, the more reps you do, because you're going closer to failure, you do more repetitions. And if that increases your total training volume, then that results in more muscle growth because muscles grow from mechanical tension on the muscle fibers. And if there's more of the tension or more time under tension, typically you get a greater growth response. So allowing you to do more reps does make you get more muscle. And most meta-analyses agree. There's one of them of the last 4 ones that found it was not significant, but the absolute increase was almost double. So it was funny enough, it was actually one of the meta-analyses, I think, that found the highest effect, but it was not statistically significant. And the other meta-analyses found smaller effects, but they were statistically significant. So the overall trend is clearly that a higher total volume, whether it's from training frequency, whether it's from your rest intervals, whether it's from training closer to failure, or simply doing more steps, increases muscle growth.
Right, and this water retention, to what degree does that contribute to further hypertrophy?
Right, so there are the other mechanisms that creatine has is water retention might be one of them. It's still a little bit speculative. Mostly what seems to happen is that due to osmosis, you attract more water into your muscles. And that makes the muscles swell, and it's all intramuscular water. So it increases your body weight. So wait, it's on your side, right? Just to make sure.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I can hear you fine.
All right, so the increase in intramuscular water might be related to the muscle growth. Like there is some speculation that cell swelling can increase muscle growth, but it's quite speculative at this point. It's mostly the increase of volume, I think, that has an effect. Then there's potential hormonal effects, and then there is also some research indicating it reduces what's it called? The gene response myostatin. It's a myostatin inhibitor.
Right.
Which probably more for advanced individuals might make a bit of a difference. So there are a few mechanisms by which creatine seems to increase strength development and muscle growth, and it does. Like there are multiple meta-analyses and reviews that conclude for most people it does work. but about a third of people are non-responders, mostly because they already have enough creatine in their muscles, and for them, it doesn't really do much for effect.
We're going to end up looking like these cows that don't have myostatin. I'm sure you've seen those photos. They look insane. If I take creatine, I do hope so.
The research on myostatin inhibitors is actually interesting. For primates, there was research a few years ago that concluded they concluded they could make it work without side effects. So they got super jacked primates. However, they developed a lot of heart conditions when they followed them around for longer, and also muscle conditions, it seems. So it may not inherently be possible to just kind of remove the brake on muscle growth in the human body, because that's what you would want to do with a myostatin inhibitor, right? We have this gene that basically restricts muscle growth, and then if we can just switch off that gene, that would be nice, or that gene expression. But it may not be possible to have that and still be healthy at the same time. So I don't think this is an issue for creatine, but it would be nice if, therefore, if there were supplements that could do that to a greater extent than creatine.
Awesome. I'm sure there will be in a couple of years. And also, in regards to creatine itself, the health side of creatine, do you think it's an interesting supplement for health overall? I've seen some studies about cognitive function. I think there's something with bone health. I think there's something also with postmenopausal women. I don't know if Dr. Scott Forbes is still here, but I know he's conducted some of the studies. What's your current take on creatine as a health supplement?
I think taking it purely for the health benefits, well, there's not much in terms of loss. So other than putting a little bit of extra strain on your kidneys, it doesn't have adverse effects. So in that sense, you could argue that, well, it might have some benefits. It most likely doesn't have any adverse effects, and it's quite cheap. So you could take it. However, if you look at the magnitude of the benefits, there have been 2 reviews published, and they kind of reached opposite conclusions. In that one review said, look, it's all pretty much trivial. If you look at all data together, then the effects are going to be very small. And the other review said, well, actually, there are significant health benefits for the brain. There's research that it can help prevent concussions, so that's particularly useful for martial artists. There's some research that it can help prevent cognitive decline in particular. Almost anything that's good for the brain will be more beneficial in elderly individuals, because in general, you could say it's easier to prevent decline than to sort of supercharge the brain and become smarter than you normally are. So there's overall, I would argue with the side that, there are a lot of these health benefits, but almost none of them on themselves are going to change your life in a way that you actually feel the difference. So it would be more like a supplement you take kind of in the background, where, it probably has some of these health benefits, especially if you're older, then it's probably worth taking, or it's more likely to be worth it. But as an actual health supplement for someone that's already healthy and below 40 years of age, very, very small effect, I would think.
Right. Do you think it will be more viable for someone that's following a vegan or vegetarian diet, just as a means of prevention?
Probably a little bit, because your creatine levels are going to be lower from the diet.
Right.
But the diet is not a big source of creatine. That's also why you need the supplementation. Like, even if you consume, maybe on a carnivore diet, it makes a meaningful difference. Like, you literally consume pounds of meat every day. But for most individuals, it doesn't make that big a difference. So it's going to be, again, a small difference.
Awesome, man. So moving on to one of the most interesting supplements, which is beta-alanine. I think this one's really conditional. There was a little bit of hype a couple of years ago, I remember. But nowadays, it seems like, at least for weight training and at least specifically for strength and hypertrophy, it wouldn't make much sense to take it just because of its mechanism, right? Can we talk a little bit about beta-alanine? When would it make sense to take it?
Yeah, it's supposed to be more beneficial for activities lasting more than 60 seconds. Like, it also helps with energy production. In that sense, it's similar to creatine, that it's kind of a fatigue buffer, but it works by increasing carnosine levels. So it's, theoretically, you could argue, well, some of the sets are kind of in that range, but I've never been particularly impressed. There was basically one study on rugby players that found a trend for greater muscle growth, but not significant. And then there were multiple studies finding no benefits for muscle growth or strength development, and a few studies finding benefits for performance, but small ones, and mainly for high rep work, strength endurance work. So not really the type of weight training you would do as a powerlifter or a bodybuilder. And I think Beta-alanine had a reputation among quite some people in evidence-based fitness as being one of the legit supplements for quite a long time, even for like maybe a good 5 years. Beta-alanine was in like the top 3 list of a lot of influencers, even the evidence-based ones. I've never really bought into the hype, you could say, and recent research has been really bad about beta-alanine. There's been a meta-analysis showing it doesn't work, basically. It doesn't work for strength development, doesn't work for muscle growth, and there have been 2 studies in the past couple of years showing it also it basically doesn't work. Like it doesn't increase muscle growth, it doesn't improve strength development. The increases in performance are trivial for low rep work. So to the extent that there is actually an increase in repetition performance, it might not even benefit muscle growth. You still there, by the way? Yeah, I think you dropped out.
I lost you a little bit, but I can hear you now. I don't know if you can hear me, Menno.
Right, so I was saying to the extent that it even influences performance, the effect is probably trivial in terms of long-term strength development. Now, maybe if you're like a CrossFitter, strongman, maybe if you're kind of pushing.
There you go. There, we're back, man.
Right.
I don't know, something with the connection, but go ahead, please. You're talking about the rugby players?
Right. So basically, I think if for rugby players and the like, people that do kind of sprints that last more than 90 seconds, then you could consider it. It might be interesting. But for pure strength development or muscle hypertrophy, I think it's close to useless.
Yeah, because as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, please. Some people suggested that maybe we haven't studied sufficient dose, that we maybe need more beta-alanine to get those effects, but more beta-alanine, as you know, come with more paresthesia, and at least for me, that's like a big no-no because it's quite uncomfortable and it messes with my performance. What's your take on that? Do you think that could be the case, and maybe some forms of beta-alanine could be interesting in the future?
Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical of that argument in general. You hear that for basically all supplements that get debunked. They basically first go through a phase where people say, well, they need more dosage, they need longer periods. So people can't make excuses. Now, the dosage is a legitimate excuse in terms of some of the studies on beta-alanine and also on citrulline. Some of the dosages used are probably too low to improve performance. On the other hand, if we don't see an effect of a low dose, then, and quite consistently don't see an effect, like there's not even a trend, then it's quite hard to think of why it would have an effect at a higher dose, because most supplements that have a dose response, they have diminishing returns, right? You get the most effect for creatine, for example. You get by far the most effect from only 2 grams or so of creatine. But then you can go up to like 5 grams, and there may still be a small additional effect. So if we're looking at creatine research and we would see no effect on study supplementing 2 grams, then I think it would be hard to argue we would see an effect at 5 grams, because normally it's the opposite. We see some effect already at low doses, and then there's a small additional effect at high dosage. So for beta-alanine and citrulline, I think some of the studies are generally slightly underdosed, but the fact we don't even see a trend means I don't think there's much there.
Yeah, it used to be interesting, but at least in practice, it's quite uncomfortable to have that itching. I wanted to ask you,
the tingling is annoying too.
Is that for you the case too?
Yeah, it's not too bad, but I definitely get the tingling.
Man, the tingling for me is the worst in my skull. I get like this tingling sensation. It just messes with my performance. And I used to take beta-alanine, but just for that, for got very sensation, I stopped, and the research led me to just stop it. It doesn't make sense.
You know, I haven't taken it in many years, so I think I only got it on the lips. Right. I like the call.
I wanted to ask you about, it's kind of a meme nowadays, but turkesterone. I wanted to ask you if turkesterone, is it the next big boy in town? Could it be interesting, or is it just hype? Is it just sketchy research, I think, from Russia, if I'm not mistaken? What's your current take on turkesterone, man?
I don't even know much about it. Like, it got super popular, and I never even understood why. It's a botanical extract, and it's like supposed to have mild phytoestrogenic effects. Like, there's people saying it's like an androgen and the like. It doesn't even make sense theoretically. Like, it seems to be one of those things where there's no research, the mechanism doesn't make any sense. It just completely came out of nowhere, where there's this idea that it's like a steroid, and it got very popular. I don't know if they did crazy good marketing or something, but from what I've seen, there's been nothing there. There's been no published research on it. The mechanism doesn't make any sense. There's just nothing, you know? And sometimes that's actually the best growth science, the pseudoscience, because you kind of just invent things completely, because then there's also nothing to debunk, right? If there's just nothing about something, you can just make everything up. That's also with some of those theories about detoxing and some of these popular diets. It just makes no sense at all from like A to Z to Z. Nothing makes sense in the whole theory. And then it's like, if you have to debunk it, it's like, where do you begin? You know, it's hard to debunk something that's wrong on so many levels. And turkesterone kind of seems to fall in that part.
Yeah, totally. As you mentioned, it got big out of nowhere. It came out of nowhere, and pretty much like HMB, it promised steroid-like effects, which, I mean, maybe in the future could be interesting, but at least for now, I don't think there's anything to discuss really ever. I just wanted to mention it because it got super popular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so at least for HMB, there was actual research, probably fraudulent research, but still published research that suggests it does work. Which is, it's kind of funny. Sometimes, I think with supplements, you really have to look at like what people are experiencing and what the science says. Because the supplement industry is an area where there is a lot of publication bias, much more than in nutritional sciences. So the fact that, for example, if we see that there is animal research about a supplement and then no human research, often that's actually a bad sign. It means that there is human research, but it wasn't published. Because almost all the research on supplements is sponsored by supplement companies. So they will only put out the good stuff.
Oh man, that's something I actually completely forgot about. I wanted to ask you about your, well, maybe not opinion, because it's not an opinion per se, but how can we make sense out of conflicts of interest? Because like you said, most supplement studies are funded by supplement companies, but that's not inherently wrong. How can we best understand this as consumers of science and supplements?
Yeah, so there's kind of the logical argument, which is, as you say, well, there's a conflict of interest, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. But I think the most interesting way to look at it is simply the empirical approach. Like, we can just look at studies, and meta-analyses have done this for supplements, for drugs, and for nutritional sciences. You can just look when there are enough studies. Okay, what is the general finding of sponsored studies? And what is the general finding of non-sponsored studies? And if you do that, for example, with, I think it is betaine, I think it's betaine, then you see that there's almost a 100% split where all the sponsored studies find benefits, and basically none of the independent studies find benefits. So in that, then you know, okay, that is very sketchy, right?
Totally.
And have done this, and in general, they find that for nutritional sciences, it does not make much of a difference. The nutritional sciences are pretty legit. If you see a study about dairy, there's a good chance it's funded by the dairy industry. But there are so many people involved, the studies are so large, and there isn't that much money to make directly. Like, it's more of a long-term thing. You know, it's not like the dairy industry, they publish a study showing milk is healthy, and then they 10x their sales. It doesn't work that way.
Sure.
But for supplements, it's much more like that, because people take the supplements, they're more interested in the science, so the sponsorship is a lot more extreme, and there's also less independent research. Because even if the dairy industry would sponsor research that shows milk is the best thing ever, then there's going to be independent research that comes along and shows it's false. So you just lose your credibility in the long term by temporarily boosting it potentially in the short term. And with supplement industry, it takes a long time before anything else comes along. By that time, you can have already pimped your supplement, essentially, sold a lot of it, and it will not be popular anymore anyway. So you can move on to the next thing. So
no, go ahead, please.
In general, the hierarchy is pharmaceutical industry, massive bias. Supplement industry, significant bias, right, but not necessarily meaning that any supplements, any sponsored study is wrong or you should discard it. And the nutritional sciences, quite legit, doesn't matter who sponsored it. Of course, you want to be a little bit more skeptical if you see something really good sponsored by someone with a conflict of interest. But in general, you can trust the data. And with supplements and drugs, you actually have to wonder if the data is even real to begin with.
Right. And what came to mind it's Jack Trudeau. I'm sure you remember that pre-workout. It used to say university studied, and I also remember some BCAAs that cited articles that the increased muscle mass and whatever. And it's kind of funny that you see this bias towards scientific research in supplement industry, which tends to be really fraudulent, right?
Yeah, so in the case of BCAAs, there are actually many legit studies, also some bunk research, I think, from Citation, but right, also many legitimate studies, because it's just protein, right? BCAAs are in your protein. The whole point, or one of the points of consuming enough protein, then it is to consume enough of all the constituent amino acids in the proteins, which includes the BCAAs, the branched chain amino acids. So if you're consuming enough protein, then kind of by definition, you are consuming enough BCAAs. But if you're not consuming enough protein, you give people BCAAs or any other form of protein, they will make better gains. Well, even BCAAs, it's not even like that. You have to combine it with meals and other substrates. But if you do that, you can easily conduct a study where you actually show that BCAAs decrease muscle soreness or muscle damage. That's been done in many studies, and they can increase muscle growth, strength development, but only in people that were not consuming enough protein to begin with. When people are already consuming enough protein, it doesn't work anymore because you already have all the BCAAs from your diet. So in that sense, it's even more insidious. And I don't know why BCAAs still live on. They're still a super popular supplement, even though there have been like a million studies and they're completely useless. Like maybe there is a context in which they are useful. In the last decade, of my experience, I have not found it. So I'm pretty confident in saying they're completely useless.
Yeah, some people try to make the case about, again, vegetarians, vegans, about decreasing fatigue in resistance sports, stuff like that. But then again, if that's the case, why just not consume more protein? And why, in the case of resistance training, endurance training, the Spanish translation, why not just consume carbohydrates instead of utilizing those amino acids for fuel, right? It kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah, with fasted training as well, people are like, oh, I take the BCAAs or I take the essential amino acids. It's like, or you just take a scoop of whey, and it's actually cheaper and better from a supplement. So, I don't know, your call.
Yeah, man. Moving on to take advantage of the time, moving on to supplements for fat loss. I wanted to ask you about caffeine, but in the perspective of appetite regulation. Do you think it's interesting, caffeine, for feeling less hungry during a deficit, stuff like that, and maybe increase your performance, or maybe just the performance side of it? And also, sorry, too many questions in one go, the habituation effect, because a lot of us cannot live without coffee. And how can we study this? How does this get studied? Because if you have people that drink a lot of coffee and then participate in a study, I know there are some requirements prior to participating in studies, but all this habituation effect, do you think it's really something to take into account when we consume it?
Okay, yeah, we have to do it one question at a time, because caffeine is a super tricky supplement, actually, which I think is widely abused. Well, by many accounts, actually, it's the most widely abused drug on the planet. And alcohol being also a contender, but many more people consume coffee than alcohol, actually. And the effects there are big nuances, where it does seem to work, but not via the mechanisms people think. And like, I think in my PT course, the section on caffeine is like 10 pages or something, because there's so much to get into. So let's start with the first one you asked, is fat loss.
Right, sure.
So appetite, fat loss. In the short term, if you give people caffeine, they will be a bit less hungry and their energy expenditure will go up. However, that effect is very transient, it's very short-lived, it's not a big increase in energy expenditure, and there is massive habituation. So when you look at studies that actually give people caffeine every day or during your training sessions for like a couple of weeks, then you see that it typically does not decrease energy intake, it does not improve fat loss, and it basically doesn't do much at all, which means there's almost complete habituation to the effect. And that's very potent, because if you look at some stimulants like nicotine or albuterol or ephedrine, those do work, because the short-term data translates much more clearly for those into long-term benefits. Whereas with caffeine, it seems like, well, short-term there may be an effect, especially in people that don't consume caffeine normally, but long-term studies paint a very, very unconvincing picture. Even high-dose caffeine supplementation daily for many weeks has no effect typically on fat loss. And that's unfortunate, because I think the biggest upside of stimulant use typically is the decrease in appetite and the resulting fat loss from the resulting lower energy intake. So yeah, caffeine does not seem to have that effect.
Right, and moving on to habituation. To what degree does coffee consumption, maybe any beverage with caffeine or a product with caffeine, because there are lots of them, impact our sensibility to its ergogenic effects? Do we need to cycle basically?
This is a very contentious topic, where at first the research seemed to be quite clear. Most researchers, I think, were quite clear on the fact that there is habituation. And so I come also from a psychological literature, and there it's very well established that there is massive habituation. And I think if you just ask anyone, do you habituate to the effect of caffeine? They will say yes, of course. Like if you've never taken caffeine, or at least not without for like the past month, and you take one Red Bull, most people feel it. And if you give people like 3 or 6 Red Bulls, they're bouncing off the walls, right? In research, people that consume a lot of caffeine are routinely given 6 milligrams per kilogram. That's kind of the reference dose, the normal dose, which for an 80-kilo individual is about 6 Red Bulls.
Right.
So that's like the normal dosage used in most studies. And yeah, if you give that to people that are not used to high-dose caffeine, that's a lot. That's a very, very big amount of caffeine. So some studies that directly measure the ergogenic effect over time, they generally find that there is habituation. Now, there have been multiple new studies and reviews saying there is no habituation. And I think they suffer from a few problems. One is they don't look at individuals over time consuming the caffeine and assessing the magnitude of the ergogenic effect. And then 2, they take dosages that are much higher during the supplement test than they normally use. So one common test, and a recent meta-analysis did this, they said, well, even if you take a dose that's below their habitual consumption, there is still an effect. And the thing is, habitual consumption is measured across the day, and the test dose is measured at one time. So it means that if you're used to consuming 6 cups of coffee, can you still benefit from taking 6 cups of coffee at once? Well, that doesn't mean you're not habituated. It just means you're not habituated to taking 6 cups of coffee at once. But you are habituated to taking 1 cup of coffee. Most people report they don't feel anything anymore at that point. So I think there are big methodological issues with this literature. And I would say that I find it hard to believe how there could not be habituation based on the long-term studies generally finding no effects. And there's also another issue, whereas what effect are we really measuring? Because most research finds that the ergogenic effect of caffeine, so the way caffeine improves performance, is mostly mental. It's mostly psychological. It's not so much that your muscles actually do more work or they're stronger. Like with creatine, they can produce more energy. There are some mechanisms by which there could be an effect, especially of higher doses. But most research finds there is no dose response of caffeine in there, which is, like I mentioned earlier, which is crazy, right? You're taking a drug, and taking more of the drug does not have more of an effect. Typically, in those cases, that means there is a very big mental component to it. Because otherwise, almost every drug on the planet has a dose-response effect.
Right.
Which, yeah, sometimes there is a threshold effect or something, but yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense if there was a real physical effect. So it's like, well, do you get fully habituated to the mental effect? Well, that depends on your perception, whether you are habituated, whether you still expect an effect to occur. So it's tricky. I would be inclined to say there is habituation based on simply the way people experience it themselves, because we're talking mostly about a mental effect probably. And if you just, like I said, if you just ask people that are used to caffeine, do they still feel an effect? And if you don't, then you are habituated in that sense. And I think that's for many people really what the meaningful metric is, because most people take caffeine to feel more energized and they can motivate themselves to train harder in the gym. And if you take the caffeine and you don't feel anything, then probably it's also not really going to do much for you.
It really is tricky. But like you said, 6 Red Bulls, it's kind of like the average dose for a power lifter, right? 6 Red Bulls and a caffeine pill, and you see these people, well, increasing further on their caffeine consumption. And also, just before finishing with caffeine, I wanted to ask you about the interference effect, if there's any, between caffeine and creatine. Do we need to separate it? Because the literature, at least to my knowledge, is not that clear in that regard.
Yeah, I'll tell you one more crazy fact about caffeine, by the way. In studies where people are not told what they're consuming, like I said, for one thing, I told you earlier, right, that the placebo effect does have a dose-response effect in some research, but the actual caffeine does not, which is crazy. But what's also crazy is that despite these enormous dosages of caffeine that people take in research, in many studies, people cannot tell if they were in the caffeine group afterwards or the placebo group. And that to me is really mind-blowing, because I would imagine if I take 6 Red Bulls or the equivalent amount of caffeine, like I am literally bouncing off the walls. Now I'm very sensitive to stimulants, but I cannot imagine I would not feel that. Not like a little bit, but I feel like I'm having a heart condition or something seriously wrong, you know?
Yeah, totally.
If afterwards they tell them, like, do you think you received 6 milligram per kilogram caffeine or a placebo? And people are like, I'm not sure. That's mind-blowing. And that, again, tells you how much of it is mental. Because stimulants, there's such a big mental effect. And I often say Red Bull because I think it drives the point home better. The research finds that Red Bull is no more effective than only the caffeine in the Red Bull. And that's only 82 milligrams, I think, for a standard can of Red Bull. Now, people take 82 milligrams just anhydrous or straight up. In research, it actually improves performance more to take it anhydrously, like in pill form, than in liquid form. But most people feel the Red Bull more than the pill. So yeah, super crazy. And I think that's the idea of you're consuming an energy drink and it has flavor and there's more feedback for the body. It seems to have more of an effect than you just consume the pill and you kind of forget about it. You can't really forget that you consume the Red Bull, and then as you have the associations with the advertising and the bull and all the athletes. So I think you kind of get more hyped up which is essentially a placebo effect, from a marketing effect even, from the fact that you're drinking energy drink as opposed to just taking a pill.
Yeah, totally. That's what I was gonna tell you, the marketing side of it. And I recall, maybe you're familiar with it, some research about taurine. I don't recall if they used Red Bull, but it was some energy drink with taurine in it, and it actually seemed to impair, as far as I remember, performance, but tend to help with recovery, something like that. So the question at hand is, to what degree do these other supplements, let's say the other ingredients, in this energy drinks, are actually useful or not just mere there for the sake of it?
Yeah, so most research finds caffeine is the only active ingredient in all of these energy drinks. Like there have been numerous studies that looked at the effect of the other ingredients in isolation or caffeine with the other ingredients without people knowing it. And most of those studies find there is no effect of any of the other substances. Nothing works, which is not what most people experience. So clearly there must be a psychological aspect to it, like a big placebo effect.
Yeah, man. Almost to finish off. I'm sorry?
No, it's fine. I still have a couple minutes.
Yeah, to be respectful of your time, I wanted to ask you briefly about, let's say, novel supplements, maybe not as novel as one would think, but in particular ashwagandha and melatonin. Do you think they're actually interesting, particularly ashwagandha for stressed out people, which is pretty much all of us? Do you think it could actually be interesting in the long run, or maybe just save your money?
So ashwagandha is another one of those where if we separate the research that in this case is not industry sponsored, but there seems to be a different kind of sponsorship. It's from, I always mispronounce it, Ayurvedic medicine, like the old Indian traditional medicine. All of that research is pretty much positive. All of the research from the West is not so positive.
Right.
So, and it's like a very traditional part of that type of medicine, of which people there are very proud, or some people are. So there does seem to be a very big bias in where the research comes from. Maybe it's again placebo effect in people in that region, because the research is done in those regions. And then when people think, oh, I'm taking ashwagandha, I think the name itself means smell of horse or something, like powerful like a horse, something like that. So yeah, I think that there is probably a big bias in that sense, and I'm pretty unconvinced of the Western literature, or at least the non-Indian literature on ashwagandha. And if it does anything, probably the main effect would be anxiolytic, so it reduces anxiety. For that, I would rather look at phenibat. I think phenibat is a lot more potent, and ashwagandha would be very subtle. And then those studies showing it increases lean body mass, like muscle mass and strength development. I'm very, very skeptical of that. Like, I don't see a mechanism of action for ashwagandha really having these effects, especially not of the magnitude seen in some of these studies from India. So I'm not very convinced about ashwagandha. And if we're taking something to reduce anxiety, I would typically first try phenibat, which actually is like a powerful drug, essentially. So you don't want to, like I have an article on my website where the one thing you have to check is the dosage. And there's a calculator, because if you use too much of phenibat or too long, you will get addicted. And it's a drug. It's not like most supplements. I mean, many supplements actually are technically drugs and some the other way around. But phenibat addiction is real. It's not like caffeine addiction where you get a bit of a headache and in a few days you're over it. No, phenibat addiction is very, very, very bad. So phenibat is, well, by that nature, you already know it's powerful. It works. Still doesn't actually work that well if you're not an anxious person to begin with, because there's not much anxiety to suppress. But yeah, for anxiolytic drugs, phenibat would be my first recommendation.
Right, and what's your current take on melatonin? Do you think it could be useful? Is it also addictive per se? What's your current opinion on melatonin?
Melatonin is great. I take it every day, but because I have a sleep disorder, not because most people need to take it every day.
Right.
So I think my body, I have non-24, so I don't produce enough melatonin. And then melatonin is basically a way to get the melatonin in the system anyway, which makes you fall asleep. And there is quite some research showing that melatonin supplementation, especially for people that don't have a very strong circadian rhythm, like they don't always go to bed at the same time, shift workers, jet lag people, they experience a big benefit from melatonin supplementation. And they can even go up to 5 milligrams. For most people, 5 milligrams gets you all the effect you need. If you just have you have some trouble falling asleep and your biorhythm is not fully stable, or even if it is stable, you can try it. Try 3 milligrams melatonin, and it can really help you fall asleep. It's non-addictive, it's perfectly safe, and sleep is incredibly important. So if you look at long-term studies of melatonin, they're actually quite promising. Some of them show muscle growth, fat loss, increased cognitive abilities, but that's mostly, I think, because you sleep more, not because melatonin really does much.
Yeah, makes total sense. If you have time just for one last supplement briefly, of course, do you think inositol could be interesting for women in particular? Do you think there's more to be found about this particular one, or can we
Which one?
begin using it right now?
Which supplement?
Inositol, I don't know how you say it in English. Here we say
Oh,
it
yeah.
inositol.
Yeah. No. Well, I haven't seen any compelling research really. I think a good diet will make it pretty much redundant with enough B vitamins. I don't see a mechanism of action there that would do much. And I also haven't seen any compelling studies showing it really does much for it.
Yeah, because I've seen it taking a little bit off here, at least in Mexico, so I wanted to ask you your opinion on that one. But anyway, Menno, I don't want to take any more of your time. As always, man, it's a huge pleasure. I do hope one day we can have you here in Mexico for a conference, at least for a cup of coffee, maybe. So I hope you have a great rest of the day, man. Thanks again for taking the time. I do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Have a great day, Menno. See you later.